Klayim Paragimel Mishnah Aleph. Aruga sheishisha tvachim al shisha tvachim. The Mishnah explains how small quantities of different kinds of vegetables may be planted together in a small garden patch. We learned in the previous parak that fields containing strips of different kinds of vegetables must be separated by at least 6 tvachim. A field in this context is an area measuring 104 square amas, 102 by 102, 10.2 by 10.2 amas. However, individual vegetable plants need to be separated from one another by only 1.5 tvachim, enough to prevent them from drawing nourishment directly from another. Our Mishnah teaches that in certain situations they need not be separated even by this amount. So, aruga shisha tvachim al shisha tvachim, in a garden patch that's 6 tvachim by 6 tvachim, zerim b'seicha chamisha zerainim, we may plant 5 kinds of vegetables, arba'a ba'arba ruchas aruga, 4 on the 4 sides of the patch, ve'echad be'emtza, and 1 in the middle. That is, a different species may be planted on each of the 4 sides of the patch, and a 5th species in the middle. According to the Rambam, the Rosh Torah formation that we mentioned in Parak Beis Mishnah Zayin can be used in the garden patch as well to maximize the area that can be planted with each species, as long as the formation to these 5 kinds are arranged in a way that one meets the other at an angle. The different species do not appear to be mixed, and there's no isser of klayim. There are 2 ways of arranging these formations for maximum benefit. The first is to leave the corners empty, then plant a strip 1 tefach wide along the middle 4 tefachim of each side with a different species. Since the corners are left empty, these strips touch each other only at the angles, a Rosh Torah formation. A large square then can be planted in the middle with a 5th species by drawing it in such a way that each of its corners touches the middle of one of the strips, once again, the Rosh Torah. So it would be that each corner is empty, and then you have 4 tefachim in the middle that are full, and then in the middle of that you have like a box that's on an angle. The second way to plant a square of 1.5 by 1.5 tefachim at each of the 4 corners, and leave the rest of each side empty. A large square can then be planted in the middle of the patch in such a way that its corners reach the empty sides of the patch, while its sides touch each of the planted corners at an angle, meaning that you have a bigger square in the middle, and you don't have 4 tefachim long on each side, but you have big corners on each side. The first way allows us to plant a total of 24 square tefachim, out of the 36 in the patch, 4 square tefachim along each side of the patch, and 8 square tefachim in the middle. So that would be 4 times 4 is 16, plus 8 is 24. The second allows us to plant 27 square tefachim, 2.25 at each corner, meaning 1.5 by 1.5, and 18 in the middle. So that would be 4 times 2.25 equals 9, plus 8 would be 27. However, it's also to plant more than 5 kinds of vegetables in a patch this size, because that would look like a mixture of plants. If the patch had a raised border surrounding it, that's a tefach high and a tefach wide, the border was a strip of earth that framed the 6 by 6 patch. This border was not only a tefach high but also a tefach wide. The 6 by 6 patch together with its border is then 8 by 8 tefachim. The elevation serves to separate the border from the rest of the patch. For this reason, planting on the border does not violate the limitation of having no more than 5 species in a patch. So zarim b'seicha shloisha asar. We may plant within this patch as many as 13 species, shloish al kol gvul gvul, 3 on each raised border, ve'echad be'emtza, and 1 in the middle of the patch. This too makes use of the Rosh Torah leniency. The corners are left empty, and 3 different species are planted in a strip on each of the 4 sides of the border. Each of these species is planted in a 1 by 1 square, and each square is 1.5 tefachim away from the next one. A large square is then planted in the middle of the 6 by 6 patch, with 1 more species in it. It is drawn in such a way that the angle of its 4 corners touches the square in the middle of each of the sides. We thus have a total of 13 species. 4 times 3 is 12, plus the 1 in the middle is going to be 13. The square in the middle is 18 square tefachim. The 12 squares planted on the border are each one a square tefach. So the total area that's being planted is therefore 30 tefachim. Lo yita roish halefes b'soich hagvul. One may not plant the head of a turnip as one of the species in the border, because it fills up the border with its large leaves. This in turn gives it the appearance of its being mixed with the species next to it. The Reish Lefes refers to the bulb, the part that's eaten. The turnip has large leaves growing out of its bulb that spread outward. Since the 3 species planted on the border are separated from one another by only a tefach and a half, the large leaves of the turnip make it look like it's growing in a mixture with the species. Rabbi Yehuda Imar Shisha be'emtza. Rabbi Yehuda says we may plant 6 types of vegetables in the middle of a patch with a raised border. According to the Tanna Kama, we may plant in a 6 by 6 patch only 5 minim, 5 different types of vegetables, even if it has a raised border. Extra minim may be planted along the raised border, but not inside the patch itself. The Mishnah now presents a different opinion. Rabbi Yehuda says that you can plant 6 types within the 6 by 6 tvachim itself. Rabbi Yehuda agrees with the Tanna Kama that the 12 species may be planted on the border surrounding the patch. However, he allows for 6 additional species to be planted in 6 diamond-shaped areas inside the 6 by 6 patch for a total of 18 species. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the presence of a planted border outside the 6 by 6 patch removes the restriction on planting more than 5 species in a patch. Mishnah Beis. Kol min zraim ein zarim ba'aruga v'chol min yiraka zarim ba'aruga. The previous Mishnah was matter 5 different species of vegetables to be planted in a 6 by 6 tefach patch, and 13 or 18 different species in a patch surrounded by a raised border. So any kind of kol min zraim ein zarim ba'aruga, any kind of plant classified by zraim cannot be planted among the 5 species permitted in a 6 by 6 garden patch. V'chol min yirakos zarim ba'aruga, but any kind of plant classified as yirakos may be planted among 5 species permitted in a garden patch. The halacha is matter us to plant many different species in a 6 by 6 patch, and that applies only in the case of the vegetables known as yirakos, not the class known as roim. Yirakos are species of vegetables that are generally grown in small amounts in garden patches. Roim are those vegetables and plants that are generally grown in large amounts in fields. When these are planted in small amounts together with other species in a garden patch, they look like kalaim with them, since they're not usually grown in small patches. Chardal va'afunin hashufin, mustard and smooth beans. These beans look as if they've been smoothed with a wooden plane, a shufina. Min zroim. They are a type of zroim, and thus may not be planted as one of the 5 species in a 6 by 6 patch. Afunin hagamlanim, large beans. In Aramaic, the word gamla, camel-like, is used to describe something unusually large. So large beans are min yarek, are classified as a type of yarek, and they may be planted as one of the 5 species in a patch. Gvol shahayu gvaya tefach v'nismayit. The previous Mishnah said that a 6 by 6 patch surrounded by a tefach high border can be planted with 13 or 18 species, 12 on the border and 1 or 6 in the actual patch. The Mishnah now expands on this halacha. So gvul shahayu gvaya tefach v'nismayit, a border that was originally 1 tefach high, but later got eroded and was reduced to less than a tefach, kasher, it's still valid, shei kasher mitchilasai, because it was valid at the start. Thus, all the species that were planted in it when it was a tefach high may be left in place. However, he cannot plant new species in it unless he rebuilds the height. Hatelam va'amas hamayim. If a furrow or a water channel, shem amukim tefach, zerim l'seichen shleisha zerainim. If you have a furrow or a water channel, the water channel dried up and you can therefore plant in it. Shehem amukim tefach, there are 1 tefach deep. Zerim l'seichen shleisha zerainim, we may plant in them 3 different kinds of seeds, of the kinds classified as yirakas, as we previously mentioned. Echem nikan ve'echem nikan, one on the top of one side of the furrow or channel, and one on the top of the other side of the channel, ve'echem be'emtza, one inside the middle at the bottom of the furrow, provided a space of 1.5 tvachim is left to them. This is the usual amount of space needed between individual vegetables. Although the one planted at the bottom of the telam or the amas hamayim appears to be completely trapped or surrounded within the other 2 species, it's nevertheless mutter, since it's in fact separated from them by the proper distance. There's no special kula on account of the telam or amas hamayim being a tefach deep. The Mishnah is teaching that even though one of them is being planted a tefach deeper than the other ones, and it looks like it's trapped between the other 2, it's still mutter. Mishnah Gimel. If a reish tor, the corner of a field containing one kind of vegetable, extended into a field containing another kind of vegetable, meaning that it was touching the side of the other field, it's mutter b'neishu nirik esayf sedeyu, because the reish tor looks like the end of his first field, and does not look like one kind of vegetable growing in a field of another kind of vegetable. This halacha is essentially the same as what we learned in Parak Beis Mishnah Zayin with regards to fields of grain. Our Mishnah teaches that the kula of reish tor applies to fields of different kinds of vegetables as well. Although the leaves of vegetable plants grow and spread out in a way that blurs the sharp distinction between the 2 fields, reish tor is nonetheless permitted. We learned in the previous parak that if someone plants a row of one kind of vegetables inside a field of another kind of vegetable, he must leave a separation 6 tvachim wide between the 2 species. So the Mishnah is going to add some halachas to this. If his field was planted with one kind of vegetable, And he wishes to plant in this field a row of another kind of vegetable by leaving the proper separation between the row and the rest of the field. That would be 6 tvachim on all sides between the row and the rest of the field. Rabbi Shmuel says, he may do so only if the row he plants extends completely through the field from one end to the other. So in this way, the new row splits the rest of the field into 2 separate fields. This makes it look like an area of its own, and since it's separated by the proper amount from each other of the other 2 fields, it's not klayim. However, if the new row does not extend completely through the field, but ends in the middle of it, it looks like an insignificant part of a large field, rather than an area of its own. This makes it look simply like a mixture of a small amount of one crop and a larger amount of another field, which would be klayim. Rabbi Kiva says, it's enough if the row has a length of 6 tvachim and the width of a full furrow, which is 6 tvachim. However, it need not extend through the entire field. A typical furrow, we explained, is typically 6 tvachim wide, including the soil that piles up on either side of the trench made by the plow. Since the new row must be at least as wide as the furrow separating it from the main crop, it too must be at least 6 tvachim wide to be permitted. Rabbi Shmuel accepts this as part of Rabbi Kiva's ruling as well. Rabbi Kiva maintains that the new furrow does not need to extend the full length of the field. As long as it is at least 6 tvachim long and starts from one end of the field, it is mutter with the proper separations, even though it's surrounded on 3 sides by another species. However, if it does not start from the edge of the field, but is surrounded on all 4 sides by the other species, it's klayim even according to Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Yehuda says, Reichav kumlei reichav haparsa. The furrow need only be as wide as the full width of the sole of a foot, which is a tefach. This is the amount of space needed to walk around the vegetable garden and water it. In summary, in order to plant a row of one kind of vegetable inside a field of a different kind of vegetable, it must be separated from the other kind by 6 tvachim. It must also reach the edge of the field at one end or at both ends. The planted row must also have the minimum width of 6 tvachim or 1 tefach. Individual plants of different species must be separated by 1.5 tvachim. 5 different species may be planted in small amounts near one another in a vegetable patch measuring 6 by 6 tvachim, provided they form reish tors to each other. If the patch has a raised border around it, even more may be planted. Okay, Mishnah Dalet. The previous Mishnah taught the halacha for planting a row of one kind of vegetable in a field of another kind of vegetable. The Mishnah now teaches the halacha for planting rows containing different kinds of vegetables next to each other in an empty field. These rows of each kind are separated from rows of the other kind by the width of the furrow, which would be 6 tvachim. Nevertheless, there are situations in which this is also according to some shittas. The Mishnah will discuss 3 different cases of how this would play out. If a person plants 2 rows of cucumbers, 2 rows of gourds, 2 rows of Egyptian beans next to one another, mutter, it's mutter because 2 rows of one kind of vegetable growing next to each other looks like a field. Since each of these vegetable fields is separated from the others by 6 tvachim, they are not klayim even though their leaves do reach each other. The 2 adjacent rows of the same species stand out and give the impression of being a field of its own. Therefore, even though the leaves of these species spread out towards each other, they do not look like klayim. The second case is shura shel kishuim, shura shel deluim, shura shel pala mitzri aser. If a person plants 1 row of cucumbers, 1 row of gourds, and 1 row of Egyptian beans, it's aser even if the rows are separated by 6 tvachim. Since the leaves of these kind of vegetables extend outward and overlap each other, they look like a jumble of different kinds of vegetables that were planted together all at once. And since there's only a single row of each kind, they do not look like separate fields, they look like rows. Planting them this way is therefore aser as klayim, even though the rows are separated from each other by 6 tvachim. When the leaves of these plants spread out and mix with each other, they make the 6 tefach separation between the rows less obvious. So people looking at these rows, therefore, do not see them as distinct rows of different kinds of vegetables, but as a number of different kinds of vegetables growing together without order in one field, as if their seeds had been tossed down together. However, when there are 2 rows of each kind, they look like separate fields of different vegetables that were deliberately planted that way. So it doesn't look like one big mishka babel. Thus, even though their leaves spread over the gap between them, the separation between them stands out more clearly. And the third case of the Mishnah, shura shel kishuim, shura shel deluim, shura shel pala mitzri, v'shura shel kishuim, Rebbe Lezer matzah v'chachamim oisrim. If a person plants a row of cucumbers, a row of gourds, and a row of Egyptian beans, and then the last row is another row of cucumbers, so Rebbe Lezer says it's mutter, and the chachamim say it's aser. Since the 2 outer rows are both cucumbers, Rebbe Lezer views them as combining to make a field of cucumbers. The other 2 rows are therefore viewed as 2 rows of other vegetables planted in a field of cucumbers, and this is mutter, as long as there's a separation of 6 tvachim between the inserted rows and the rest of the field, as we learned in the previous Mishnah. The Chacham do not consider this to be a field of cucumbers because the 2 rows of cucumbers are not next to each other. Okay. Mishnah Hey. A person may plant a cucumber and a gourd in the same hole, even though these two species are climbing with each other, as we saw in the previous Mishnah. Provided that this plant leans on this side of the hole and the other plant leans to the other side of the hole, provided that he forces the stem of one plant to grow in one direction and the stem of the other to grow in another direction. This technique is effective even with cucumbers and gourds, despite the natural tendency of their stems and leaves to spread and become tangled with the other plants. It goes without saying that it's effective with other vegetables that do not have this tendency, meaning if you have something that grows straight up, that's not going to get mixed in with anything else, that the branches and the leaves aren't going to get mixed in with anything else, then that's not going to be a problem. He makes the hair of this plant lean to here and this side, and the leaves of the plant lean on that side. Over here it refers to the seyar, means the leaves of the trees. These are very big insight of many of the Mishnayos that we've been discussing until now, that really it's mutter, because all the isurim that we've been talking about up to this point in regard to klayim, it's only usur because of maras ayin. Klayim is usur only when two species appear to be mixed. Since the two plants growing in different directions do not appear to be mixed, planting them together in one hole is going to be mutter. The isur deraisa of klayim, of kilei zraim, is only where the plants look mingled. This is the primary factor that the Chachamim considered when they decreed which formations are klayim and which ones not. By training the stems and forcing them and the leaves to grow in different directions, the isur of klayim is eliminated because there's no isur of maras ayin, there's no appearance of a mixture, there's no maras ayin over here, so it's fine. So according to what we're saying over here, the Mishnah is defining the rule for the isur of klayim deraisa. Different species next to one another are not klayim unless they look like they're mixed together, as the Chachamim explained in different situations. Others learn that the Mishnah is defining the rule for the Durabanans of klayim. Midaraisa, nothing is klayim unless the seeds of two different species are planted together at the same time, but mapolas yat, dropping from the hand. All other situations are forbidden only midrabanon. However, the Chachamim asserted any formation that looks mixed because it gives the appearance of wrongdoing, maras ayin. Our Mishnah is discussing a case where two seeds were not placed in the hole at the same time. Nevertheless, if they're allowed to grow together, people may suspect that they were planted together. This suspicion disappears when the person forces and trains the stems to grow in different directions. Okay, Mishnah Vav. If a person's field is planted with onions and he wishes to plant rows of gourds in it, what should he do? Gourds are a special problem because their leaves spread out like ivy all over the adjoining areas, as we saw in Mishnah Dalet. The halach in the Mishnah will tell us that this applies to two other species over here also. The Mishnah speaks of a field of onions as an example, and the same would be true of any kind of vegetable as well. So Rabbi Shmuel says, he uproots 2 rows of onions, thereby clearing a space of 8 amas wide. A row of gourds is 4 amas wide. In order to make room for a row of gourds this size, he must uproot the equivalent of 2 such rows of onions. In other words, he must uproot the onions from a strip 8 amas wide. And then he plants 1 row of gourds, which is 4 amas wide, in the center of this clearing, this empty area. This leaves 2 empty amas on each side of the row to separate the gourds from the onions on either side. So he has 2 rows of onions, and then a space, and then a row of gourds, and then a space, and then another 2 rows of onions. He then leaves standing the onions that are in a place fit for 2 rows. That is, he leaves the next 8 amas of onions growing in their place. The Mishnah calls this 2 rows because this is the size of 2 rows of gourds. He may then uproot the next 2 rows again, clearing a space 8 amas wide, and plant 1 row of gourds 4 amas wide in the center of this clearing, and he may continue this pattern throughout the field. The result will be a field with alternating 8 amma wide rows of onions followed by a 2 amma gap, a 4 amma wide row of gourds followed by another 2 amma gap, and another 8 amma row of onions. Each strip of gourds is thus separated from any other strip of gourds by 12 amas. 2 amas of a gap, plus 8 amas of onions, plus 2 amas a gap, so 2 plus 2 plus 8 is going to be 12. Rabbi Shmuel requires 2 chumras over here. A 2 amma gap, that's 12 tvachim, between the gourds and the onions instead of the usual 6 tvachim needed between 2 rows of the vegetables. I mean, he needs 2 6 tvachim spaces. And the second chumrah that Rabbi Shmuel is makbid on over here is a distance of 12 amas between the rows of gourds. A 2 amma gap is needed because the leaves of the gourds spread out and make a smaller separation hard to notice, as we mentioned in the previous Mishnayos. The 12 amma distance between the rows of gourds is necessary in order for them to maintain their status as individual rows. If they are any closer, they will combine with each other to be seen as fields of gourds. Having a field of gourds overlapping a field of onions is considered k'laim. A row inside a field does not look like k'laim if it has a proper separation, but a field inside a field does look like k'laim even with the proper separation. Rabbi Kiva says, he uproots 2 rows of onions, and then he plants 2 rows of gourds in their place, filling up the 8 amas that he cleared. He does not have to leave a 2 amma gap. However, he must leave a gap the width of 6 tvachim, as is the halacha between all rows of vegetables. He then leaves standing the onions that are in a place fit for 2 rows. That is, he leaves the next 8 amas of onions growing in their place. And he uproots the next 2 rows of onions, and plants 2 rows of gourds in their place. He may continue this pattern throughout the field. According to Rabbi Kiva, there's no need for a 2 amma gap between the gourds and the onions, and it's enough for the rows of gourds to be separated by just 8 amas. Rabbi Kiva disagrees with Rabbi Shmuel on 2 accounts. First, in Rabbi Kiva's opinion, there's no need to leave 2 amas between the onions and the gourds. 6 tvachim is enough. Secondly, it's not necessary to leave a distance of 12 amas between the rows of gourds. A distance of just 8 amas is enough to prevent them from combining into a field. The furrows are left in the 8 amma area that was cleared, thus he does not actually plant gourds in the entire 8 amas that he cleared. So the furrows do not need to be 6 tvachim wide throughout their entire length, only for a distance of 6 tvachim. After that, they may narrow into the shape of a Rosh Tor until they come to a point at the end of the field, so they could, even on one side there's going to be a space, but on the other side they could be right up to each other. The Chachamim say, if there are less than 12 amas of space between one row of gourds and the other one, he may not keep the onion plants in between them. The Chachamim agree with Rabbi Shmuel that 12 amas is needed between one row of gourds and the next, but they agree with Rabbi Kiva that it's not necessary to leave a 2 amma gap between the gourds and the onions. The Chachamim agree with Rabbi Shmuel that 12 amas must separate individual rows of gourds from one another in order for them not to be regarded as a field. However, they disagree with him in that they hold that a furrow 6 tvachim is enough to separate a row of gourds from a field of onions, just that it is effective in separating a row of any other vegetable that is planted inside a field of vegetables. So according to the Chachamim, he must leave the equivalent of 3 rows of onions growing between the rows of gourds. B'kitzur, what do we have from this Mishnah? A row of gourds is permitted in a field of onions provided there is a proper separation between it and the onions. 2 amas according to Rabbi Shmuel, 6 tvachim according to Rabbi Kiva and the Chachamim. However, 2 rows of gourds are permitted in a field of onions only if the rows of gourds are far enough apart from each other that they do not combine to form a field of their own. 12 amas according to Rabbi Shmuel, and according to the Chachamim Rabbi Kiva, only 8 amas. This is because fields intermingled with each other are forbidden even if their individual sections are separated by the distances mentioned above. 2 rows each of gourds, cucumbers, and Egyptian beans planted together in an empty field are mutter if they are separated from one another by 6 tvachim, by an amma. Even Rabbi Shmuel agrees in this case that there is no need for 2 amma separation. However, single rows of gourds and these 2 other vegetables planted together in an empty field are also even if they are separated from one another by 6 tvachim. Mishnah Zayin. Dlas beyarak kiyarak. The Mishnah continues the halach as a k'laim in regards to dalas. A Greek gourd, a dalas, planted next to a vegetable field, as like any other kind of vegetable planted next to a field of different vegetables. The 2 must be separated by a gap of 6 tvachim. The leaves of a Greek gourd are bigger, and they become more thickly entangled with the leaves of neighboring vegetables than do the leaves of other gourds. Nevertheless, even in the case of this kind of dalas, a separation of 6 tvachim is going to be enough. And if you wish to plant it next to a grain field, we must give it a base raiva of separation, the same as any other vegetable planted next to a grain field, even though that normally these leaves grow much bigger, but we don't have to separate it more. If his field is planted with grain, and he wishes to plant a row of Greek gourds in it, we give it 6 tvachim for its work area to serve as a separation, which is a gap of 6 tvachim that must be left between the row of gourds and the grain. This term work area, naitzin lavoidasa, refers to the empty space next to a planted area where the farmer stands while he does his work. The Mishnah uses this term to describe the area that must be left empty to separate between the species. As we will see in the next parak, that the work area is considered part of the planted area, and that's why we cannot plant one species in the work area of another. So although the single gourd must be separated from a field of grain by a beis reva, a row of gourds needs to be separated by only 6 tefachim. This is because a row looks more like a place in its own right, and therefore more separate from the fields around it. A single plant, on the other hand, looks like something that can mix into the field even when it's 6 tefachim away. A single gourd must therefore be separated by a full beis reva. Our Mishnah seems to go against what it says in Parak Beis Mishnah Yud, that there we learned that a row of vegetables and a field of grain must be separated by a beis reva, and not just 6 tefachim. Here the Mishnah says that even a row of Greek gourds planted in a field of grain needs to be separated by only 6 tefachim. The answer is that the Mishnah there is speaking of a row that is square. Our Mishnah is speaking of a row that's rectangular, which is longer than it is wide. So the Chachamim were more machmir with the square than with the rectangle, and required a greater separation for squares than for vegetables. So a square row of vegetables in a field of grain needs the separation of beis reva, whereas a rectangle row needs a separation of only 6 tefachim. Nevertheless, even a rectangular row must have a 6 tefach separation for a length of 10.5 amas. Thus, in turn, implies that the kula of allowing a rectangular row to be separated from a field of grain by a width of just 6 tefachim was said only for a row that's at least 10.5 amas long. Vim higdila. If the row of gourds afterwards grew large and its leaves spread into the 6 tefach gap, he must uproot the grain in front of it to maintain the 6 tefach gap. When the leaves of the gourd grow until they reach the grain of the leaves must be removed. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Noisan lavoidasa arba amas. Rabbi Yossi says we must give it 4 amas for its work area to serve as a separation. That is, a gap of 4 amas must be left between the row of the tvua and the delas. There are 6 tefachim in an amma, so Rabbi Yossi measures it 4 times the 6 tefach separation required by the Tanna Kama. Amrullah is the Chachamim said to him, Hatach mezum and agefen, will you treat this case of gourds in a field of grain more strictly than we treat a row of grapevines? The laws of Klayim are stricter for grapevines than for anything else. When grapevines are planted in such a way that they are considered a vineyard, they become subject to stricter laws of k'lei. This means that not only is it forbidden to plant any other species within the 4 amas of them, but also that if something is planted there, both it and the grapes become forbidden to eat or have benefit from. By contrast, the laws of Klayim for other species is that while it is forbidden to plant or maintain them, they do not become asur b'hana or even ba'achila. Yet, the halacha is that a single row of grapevines does not have to be separated from other species by more than 6 tefachim. How then can you require 4 amas separation for a single row of delas? In the next parak, there's a machlekes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel whether a single row of grapevines is considered a kerem. According to Beis Hillel, it's not. It's not considered a vineyard. If so, we need only to distance another species from it by 6 tefachim. So what's Rabbi Yossi saying that you need to separate 4 times the amount of that? So Amar Lami said to them, we do find that the delas is stricter in some ways than the halachas of a grapevine. What are we talking about? Because for a single grapevine, we give just the 6 tefachim of its work area to serve as a separation from a field of grain. Whereas for a single gourd, we require a beis reva, as we learned in the beginning of the Mishnah. Halacha requires a beis reva of separation from a field of grain was an old ruling, and Rabbi Yossi knew that the Chachamim accepted it. So he argued to the Chachamim that since even you agree that a single gourd requires more spacing from grain, a beis reva, than a single kerem, which is 6 tefachim, it should not surprise you that a row of gourds planted in a field of grain also requires a great separation, 4 amas, than a single row of grapevines. So Meir Omer Mishum Rabbi Yishmael Kol Shleisha Delum LeBeisa LeYavi Zar LeSeich Beisa. Both Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim agree that a separation of a beis reva is enough for a single gourd planted next to the field of grain. The Mishnah now brings another shita that argues. Meir says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael that whenever there are 3 gourds in a beisa, that's an area of 50 by 50 amas, LeYavi Zar LeSeich Beisa. One may not bring other seeds into the area of the beisa. According to Meir, you must leave an empty space of 1/3 of a beisa around the gourd before being able to plant another species. So if there are 3 gourds spread out throughout this beisa, no other species may be planted in it. Rabbi Yossi ben Achaytef Efrasi Omar Mishum Rabbi Yishmael Kol Shleisha Delum LeBeis Kar LeYavi Zar LeSeich Beis Kar. The Yerushalmi explains that Rabbi Yishmael originally said what Meir quotes him as saying, Later in life, Rabbi Shmuel changed his mind. The version of the Mishnah now cites is Rabbi Shmuel's later opinion. There is machlekes how to understand Yerushalmi altogether. According to a different understanding of Yerushalmi, Reb Meir's quote of Rabbi Shmuel is his later opinion, and the one that we're going to say now was his original plan. The question is, who's Rabbi Yossi? Is that Rabbi Yossi in this Mishnah or somebody else? Perhaps it's somebody else. Rabbi Yosef ben Achayta Fefrasi. So, Kol Shlesha Dulum LeBeis Kar, whenever there are 3 gourds in a base core, that's 30 times a base saw, one may not even bring other seeds into the base core. It's not clear why Rabbi Shmuel required such large separations around the gourds, unless he held that the leaves go so far that it would be a problem of climb over here as well. Ad kan.